to see such a wonderful turnout here. I'm so glad that you've all come to hear this incredible speaker. I know that you will enjoy yourselves. I want to start off by saying how excited I am about the whole series of events that the organizers of Black History Month 2012 have put together. So much going on this month, and I would really like to thank both the student and the faculty organizers with Black History Month 2012 because they've really done an incredible job. Particularly Dr. Jermaine Archer, Professor Kara Perdue have worked wonders, and all the students on the committee. So a big round of applause for them. I'd also like to thank Student Affairs, particularly Dean Raleigh Buchanan, the Department of American Studies, particularly Joe Manfredi, and I'd really like to thank SGA for their generous funding and support for this event. It is my great privilege to introduce to you Dr. Johanna Fernandez. I have long admired her scholarship, and I'm really happy that she is able to come and speak with us today. Dr. Fernandez is an activist, film producer, and historian of 20th century American history at Baruch College at the City University of New York. Her research has been published in the Journal of Urban History, in Race and Reason, and in field-defining anthologies on the civil rights movement. Dr. Fernandez is currently working on her forthcoming book on the Young Lords Party. The manuscript is under contract with Princeton University Press and is tentatively entitled When the World Was Their Stage, A History of the Young Lords Party, 1968 to 1974. And you can find all this information in her bio in the program. As if all that tremendous research and scholarship weren't enough, she's also the producer of Justice on Trial, a documentary about Mumia Abu-Jamal and the criminal justice system. She does really tremendous work, and I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Fernandez here today, and then I hope you'll stay for the Q&A period after her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. I'd also like to thank Dr. Carew for inviting me here, and to the History Department and to American Studies. So where does one begin talking about the Young Lords? Before I start, I want to say that I've given a number of talks on the Young Lords, and I write about the 1960s, generally speaking, but also about the post-World War II period, which was a moment of transformation that in many ways produced the society in which we live today. What's different about this talk is that I'm talking about the Young Lords, I think for the first time during Black History Month, and that I'm talking about the Young Lords for the first time in a moment of renewed social struggle here in the United States, and this period of renewed social struggle was launched by the Occupy Wall Street protests that kind of began to sweep the United States like a hurricane beginning last September at the start of this academic year. So the fact that I'm now thinking about, writing about, and talking about the movements of the 1960s in the context of an emerging social movement in the United States means that I have to talk about the Young Lords differently. So this is really an honor and a pleasure to be challenged to discuss the Young Lords against the context of an experience that we are having right now in American society, such that this project of transforming the world and social struggle is not an abstract thing, but it's something that many of you have begun to see, to explore, and maybe even participate in yourselves. I'm going to talk today about the Young Lords and the ways in which race and racism manifested itself in the organization. And I do that because it's Black History Month, And because even though some of you might understand the Young Lords as a predominantly Puerto Rican organization, the fact is that the Young Lords modeled itself after the Black Panther Party. And interestingly enough, the Young Lords was a profoundly diverse organization, racially and ethnically, even though it was a self-identified Puerto Rican nationalist organization. So I'm going to talk about how race functioned in the organization, why it was important, and why would Puerto Ricans or Latinos who are imagined oftentimes as the enemies of African Americans, right, in urban spaces with all this gang war, how was it that these two groups came together? So that's essentially what I'm going to focus on today, and hopefully we can draw on some of the lessons of the 1960s. This is one of my favorite photographs of the Young Lords. It is a photograph in New York. This is a march to the UN in 1969, and the Young Lords were literally going through one of the major thoroughfares of New York. I think it was 2nd Avenue. They were marching along 2nd Avenue toward the UN, and their demand was independence for Puerto Rico. Okay, so the Young Lords is one of the most, or the history of the Young Lords offers one of the most potent examples of cross-ethnic solidarity between African Americans and Puerto Ricans. So how did these organizations demonstrate common cause exactly? You probably know that the Black Panther emerges in California, in Oakland, after the Watts riots of that city in the mid-1960s, and the Young Lords emerge in Chicago as a politicized gang in the aftermath of the Puerto Rican riots, which happened in that city in 1967. And both of these organizations are united by their politics. They are radical, militant, and they call themselves revolutionaries. So how exactly was it that these organizations demonstrated common cause? Both identified the social and economic problems confronting both groups, that is, African Americans and Puerto Ricans, and both fought to improve those conditions. Now, what are some of the issues that the Young Lords addressed? They addressed the issue of sanitation in poor communities. In East Harlem, in New York, where the Young Lords organized, there was an enormous amount of garbage. This was before the age of garbage cans in poor neighborhoods or neighborhoods generally. And this was a very poor community, and the Young Lords essentially decided that part of the struggle to fight for justice had to be local, and that had to start in the community, and they literally started with the garbage. And this is an example of one of their protests. Essentially, they picked up the garbage in the neighborhood, and they protested the Sanitation Department's lack of services. And so what they did was that they literally threw the garbage in the middle of the street, stopped traffic, and inevitably members of the community would burn the garbage, and this would stop traffic and created a crisis for commuters in New York. They addressed the shortcomings of the education system. So they published a newspaper called Palante, and they discussed the problems with public education in New York City. They discussed the problem of joblessness, which was rampant in New York, the problem of poor housing and urban renewal, right? This exemplifies the kind of dilapidation of the urban landscape. This is an apartment in East Harlem, and part of what they were doing was calling attention to the poverty in which people lived. Literally, the fact that so many buildings in Harlem had been deemed unfit for human habitation. They addressed the issue of childhood hunger. Just back to the housing issue. Part of what we see happening during this period in the 1940s and 50s is urban renewal. The fact that buildings are torn down and the projects are being built, but also highways are being built in places where homes were previously erected. And they had a critique of this local policy of urban renewal. They considered it spick removal, and in fact, the Black Panthers also called it Negro removal. But going back to the other things that they did, they addressed the issue of childhood hunger. And this is something with which the Black Panthers are associated. And again, the Young Lords modeled themselves after the Black Panther Party. Essentially, the fact that school children today are fed breakfast in the morning is a product of the struggles of the Black Panthers. And let me just give you a sense of how old the Black Panthers and the Young Lords were. They were 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 young people who saw something wrong with their society and wanted to change it. And essentially what the Black Panthers and the Young Lords did was that they served breakfast to children in churches and in community institutions in the morning before they left to school. Their argument was that if a child is hungry, he or she cannot possibly begin the process of learning. They also fought against police brutality, drug addiction. This is an example of the, this is just a great picture of them serving breakfast to children. Of course, they addressed the issue of police brutality, which is present with us today. They addressed the issue of drug addiction in communities like the Bronx, East Harlem, neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And they also addressed the issue of public health and the high incidences of childhood lead poisoning, the high incidences of tuberculosis, and the problem of public hospitals and long waits in public hospitals in New York City. And they actually had a 10-point health program in which they called for free health care for all. Those campaigns around health within the Young Lords organization are fascinating, and I don't really have time to go into them, but maybe we can talk about them during the discussion. The most important intervention of the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party came in the form of analysis. What they believed, what were their ideas, and what they argued. They disseminated their ideas through their public meetings, through their radio program on WBAI. They actually had a radio program, and through their newspaper called Palante. And Palante means forward in struggle in Spanish. This is Richie Perez, whom some of you might know. He was an activist in the Young Lords organization, but he is solely responsible for a whole series of gang truces in the Bronx between warring gangs in the 1980s and in the 1990s. He's since passed away, but he is here at a demonstration in front of Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, which they occupied in the 1960s, in the late 1960s. So they disseminated their ideas, their analysis, through these public meetings that they held, through their radio program on WBAI, and through their newspaper. Here you have one of their publications, The Ideology of the Young Lords Party. That pamphlet of theirs. At a moment when culture of poverty arguments were dominant in American society, and they still are today, they argued that the problems afflicting African Americans and Puerto Ricans were not cultural, they were not racial, but rather structural, economic, and beyond the control of these two groups. So essentially, they put forth an analysis of social problems that put the blame not on individuals, but on the economic system, on the institution of racism. And that was probably one of their most important contributions. They also argued that capitalism was to blame for the problems confronting both African Americans and Puerto Ricans. They injected a class analysis into the equation of how to achieve liberation, and they argued for a socialist society. And here is one of their clothing drives, and here you see they had a platform with 13 points, and the 13th point of their platform was, "We want a socialist society." So again, we're talking about a young group of people who had an analysis of what was wrong with the world. They had a critique of capitalism and class-divided society. They were very critical of the 1%, and they argued that in order to resolve the problems of society, we need to build a different kind of system called socialism. So the Young Lords emerge in 1968 in Chicago and in 1969 here in New York at a moment of heightened radicalization. And I just want to give you a sense of how was it that these young people came to these incredibly radical ideas in the United States at this particular moment. It's important to understand that they came to become activists after a whole decade of sustained struggle in the civil rights and Black Power movements. After they had experienced directly police brutality and government repression in the course of struggle. So just to give you a sense of what this meant and how they reached these radical conclusions about the society in which they live, I think the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations are a case in point. The Occupy Wall Street protesters were evicted not too long ago from Zuccotti Park, and they were evicted in a very violent way by the police and by the mayor, who pretty unrepentantly said that they needed to leave Zuccotti Park. Why? Do any of you remember? For sanitation reasons, yes, that was one of the issues. And so the assumption is that the protesters are dirty. But why else? Does anyone remember? What were they protecting? Private property. Private property. So we usually think that the government and the police are there to protect citizens. But when there is a conflict in society, the real reasons why the police exist in society begin to emerge, which is that at the end of the day, one of the major responsibilities of the police is to protect private property. And Zuccotti Park is a private park. So that was the reason given for their eviction. This is the same exact process that the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and the activists of the 1960s underwent. They learned in the course of struggle how power works in society. And the fact that those Occupy Wall Street protesters were evicted, not only the Occupy Wall Street protesters, but in California, students who were protesting, what happened to them? They were tasered, and they were, there's that photograph of the police essentially spraying them with the poison. That experience gives you a sense that the ideas that we're taught growing up about freedom of speech and the fact that the nation stands for democracy and justice, all of that falls apart completely when you go out to protest peacefully and you're confronted with such violence on the part of the state. So Occupy Wall Street protesters underwent or are beginning to undergo of understanding really what society is about and how it works, that the Young Lords and the Black Panthers underwent. And in this process of fighting for a better world and understanding that the system would only deliver so much, they began to essentially lose faith in government, but also in the system and in the system of capitalism. So heightened expectations about what they could achieve, combined with the experience of coming up against a system that was only willing to deliver so much, was the perfect recipe in the 1960s for radicalization. And the experience of SNCC in 1960 was critical to this process of radicalization. Now, what do I mean by SNCC? The civil rights organization known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? SNCC was important, much like Occupy Wall Street is important today. SNCC consolidated and gave organizational form to the new mood in American society in the first months of 1960. How exactly did they tap into the new mood? They actually led these sit-ins in the South that spread like wildfire, and I'm just going to give you a sense of what that looked like. They gave birth to this new trend of activism, which was militant, bold, and less willing to compromise. They captured the imagination of a generation with their protests. And what exactly were their protests? That on February 1st, 1960, 4 African-American students sat down at the whites-only section of the Woolworth's Diner in their town and demanded to be served. By the end of February, this happened on February 1st, by the end of February, sit-ins had taken place in 32 southern cities. By March, another 42 cities were added to the list of cities that were conducting sit-ins, and the South was caught in a brush fire. Now, this is very similar to the Occupy Wall Street protesters. The civil rights movement had been going on by 1960 for a long time. You had the Montgomery bus boycott, the campaigns of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, but it took the actions of these 4 young people to really bring another wave of young people into activity, much like happened during the Occupy Wall Street protesters. These students who sat in at Woolworth's on February 1st, 1960, they didn't know that they were going to essentially kick off the decade that would transform American society. They did their thing. They were committed to social justice, to having social justice, and to come to the United States immediately. And students right here in the North, not at Old Westbury, because Old Westbury was not around until 1968, but students at CUNY, the City University of New York, at other SUNY campuses, at Columbia, at Barnard, at NYU, they looked at what those students were doing and they were blown away, and they said, yes, this is what we want to do. This speaks to the problems of our society and what we need to do to transform it. Occupy Wall Street happened one day, and before we knew it, there were Occupies all over the country. I just came back from Berlin, where I was speaking on the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, and I spoke at the Occupy Berlin protests, which look exactly like the Occupy Wall Street protesters and their encampment here in New York. So this is an idea that really didn't begin, interestingly enough, in the United States. This idea that young people in this period could transform the world started where in this period? Anyone? We tend to think in New York that we're the center of the universe. I'm a New Yorker. I'm one of those people. But this new wave of protest in this period, which I believe is the beginning of a long period of struggle in the United States, began in the Middle East. Right? It started in Tunisia, it spread to Egypt, And then it went to Wisconsin before it landed in New York in Occupy Wall Street. So what we're seeing is that what happened in the 1960s, in terms of the beginning of people taking control of their lives and feeling like they could actually change society, is beginning to happen here in the United States. However, I just talked about the SNCC protesters. Despite their militancy, the activists of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which by the way included Black students, Latino students, and white students, and some Asians even though they were militant, the activists were very naive politically. They really didn't understand their society. The failure to understand the big political picture and the structure of power that the civil rights movement was confronting and was up against was widespread among SNCC members. SNCC members believed that if they would put their bodies on the line, that if they would protest, the government would actually respond and make good on its promise of democracy. But they actually underwent a wake-up call over the course of the 1960s, and it was their run-in with the Democratic Party and the limitations of the Democratic Party to produce change that led to their radicalization, but also the confrontations that they experienced with the police when they were in protest, when they were organizing, but also the violence they experienced personally at the hands of the National Guard when they were protesting the the Vietnam War, in the anti-war movement. Those experiences essentially led them to become familiar with other moments of social protest and revolution in history. And many of them, in fact, began to read the writings that came out of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in the 19-teens. They began to read the writings of the Chinese Revolution. They started reading Mao, Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, the writings of Frantz Fanon, who's a psychologist and a revolutionary from Martinique, who actually fought in the Algerian Revolution. So they began to read and educate themselves about the people who had tried to transform society and make revolution in the past. In the process of coming up against a system that was only going to deliver so much, in the process of coming up against police repression, government repression, they became revolutionaries. Now I'm going to talk about, this is their paper, by the way, this is their newspaper. They understood that in order to influence society, they needed a tool that they could share with other people who were not members of the organization to put forth their analysis. So this was their newspaper. The Black Panther Party also had a newspaper called Black Panther. And this is one of the leading members of the organization, Juan Gonzalez, who's now a writer for the Daily News, and he's on Democracy Now! And he is on the train selling a newspaper to someone who looks like a Puerto Rican man who's probably going to work. So now I want to talk about this issue of race within the organization, and one of the reasons why I think the Young Lords is a fascinating group. In the history of the Young Lords is imprinted a story of Latinos exploring the genesis and root causes of racism, not just in the United States, but in Latin America. This is a subject that is rarely discussed amongst Latinos. The fact that there was slavery in Latin America, that there are Black people in Latin America, not just in the Caribbean, like in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and Cuba, but actually in Mexico, in Peru, and other countries of Latin America. So the history of the Young Lords is important because within it is imprinted a story of Latinos exploring the issue of race and racism, not just here in the United States, but in the Americas. In the history of the organization is also imprinted the story of a fight by Latinos against racism in the United States. Racism in its traditional form, i.e. the government essentially institutionalizing racism, but also non-traditional manifestations of racism within the Puerto Rican community and other Latinos. They're also important because the Young Lords, by virtue of being Puerto Rican and being a discriminated minority group, begins to expand the notion of racism in American society. We in America tend to think of things in black and white, right? African American or white American, but here you have now this huge group of people, Puerto Ricans, who don't consider themselves black, although many of them are black, and they don't necessarily consider themselves white. They experience discrimination because of the language they speak, but they also have a long history in the island nation of the United States controlling their politics and their economy. So these are all of the issues that the Young Lords organization and its activities and history brings to the table. The Young Lords are important because they emphasize the centrality of the African American experience to the way race is understood in the United States. So in fact, the Young Lords are radical and they're important because while other Latinos wanted to distance themselves from African Americans, the Young Lords said absolutely not. If we are going to understand our own discrimination in this country, we have to understand the discrimination suffered by African Americans and the history of slavery of African Americans in this country. So they demonstrated a tremendous amount of solidarity with African Americans. They also welcomed African American membership and leadership in the ranks of the organization. And they built one of the most multi-ethnic and multiracial organizations of the period. The work of the Young Lords represents one of the most organic and honest attempts at cross-ethnic and cross-racial solidarity in 20th century America. And this is a history of the civil rights and black power movements that we don't understand, right? When we think about the civil rights and black power movements, we think, oh, it was mainly African Americans fighting for their right to vote and fighting against discrimination. But in fact, we undersell the power of the civil rights and black power movements because in fact, the black power movement and the civil rights movement of which the Young Lords were a part were profoundly diverse. There were Asian people who were members of the Young Lords and of the Black Panther Party, by the way. But that's not something that we read about, in part because in the United States, we tend to prefer very simplistic understandings of history and of class and of race. Okay, the Chicago Young Lords set the example. When they aligned, that's where the organization emerged, the Young Lords emerged in Chicago, and the Chicago Young Lords aligned themselves with the most politically persecuted and the most maligned organization of the period, the Black Panther Party, an organization that was identified by the head of the FBI as America's #1 national security risk. That's what is the name of the gentleman who's the head of the FBI? J. Edgar Hoover, about which there's a film out these days. So J. Edgar Hoover identifies the Black Panther Party as public enemy #1. And the Black Panther and the Young Lords say, okay, we're in solidarity with them. So that just gives you a sense of the possibilities of this moment. In Chicago, that kind of coalition between the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, by the way, at this point were a gang, and they became transformed into a political organization during this period. That made sense, that coalition made sense in a city like Chicago, where urban renewal exacerbated racial turf wars and gang activity. Essentially, with all of this migration of Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, Mexican Americans, and African Americans to the city, Chicago, which was predominantly white working class, there was a lot of racial tension, and then urban renewal essentially meant that Puerto Ricans and African Americans, they were moved out of their neighborhoods, and they usually had to move into the neighborhood next door, which was often white. This kind of tension created a situation in which people had to get protection to get from their building to the school. And this is why you have this emergence of gangs in the 1940s and 50s. And the fact that Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans were a small minority in Chicago meant that it made sense for them to try to ally with each other to leverage their power locally in these gangs. So it made sense that in Chicago, these two organizations would come together, but leadership was critical to the Black Panthers and the Young Lords coming together. And Fred Hampton, who was a very important, respected, and eloquent leader of the Black Panther Party, who was killed by a government program called COINTELPRO in the middle of the night, his leadership was critical to this cross-racial, cross-ethnic coalition. And he is responsible for the emergence of the Rainbow Coalition, a coalition of Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and poor whites from Appalachia. Fred Hampton argued that even though we're usually fighting ourselves on the issue of race and racial discrimination, we have a lot in common on the basis of our shared class interests. So the New York Young Lords eventually deepened the organization's analysis of race. And they built an organization of African Americans and Puerto Ricans. And these are some of the articles that they're going to publish. This is Puerto Rican racism. This is one of the articles in their newspaper. They publish a wide range of articles that address the history of non-whites in Puerto Rico and in Latin America. They talk about Native American society in Puerto Rico, the Native Americans of Puerto Rico, and what influences they had on Puerto Rican society. They discuss in their newspaper the nature of African slavery on the island, how African slavery influenced islands like Puerto Rico, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and influenced the racism of Puerto Ricans. They also talked about Native American and African influences on Puerto Rican Spanish, and they began to identify words that are used in Spanish, like bohío and enagua, and they were like, these words that we use and we're totally unaware of their origins, some of these words are actually Native American and some of them are African. So we have a history of blackness and in us. They also wrote about Native American and African resistance to Spanish rule in Puerto Rico and in other parts of Latin America. And they wrote about the history and importance of Loíza, which is a predominantly black region in Puerto Rico. And they explored and discussed in their newspaper its Nigerian cultural and musical legacies. They also wrote about African American history, and they had bios of famous black people in the Americas, like famous leaders in Puerto Rico, like Maceo. These are black men who were critical to Puerto Rican history, but that hadn't been written about. Maceo, Betances. They also wrote about Sojourner Truth and Malcolm X in their newspaper. But they also published articles that attempted to theorize race in the Americas. These articles explain different conceptions of race as they emerged in Puerto Rico under Spanish colonialism, rather than as racism had emerged in the United States under British colonialism. They talked about the blanqueamiento movement in their writings, the fact that in Puerto Rico and in Latin America, The rule was that a drop of white blood brings you closer to the white ideal. That's how Spanish colonialism organized itself ideologically. However, in the United States, the rule that dominated was what? Does anyone remember? Racially, in terms of racial ideology. And who's black and who's not. The one-drop rule. So they began to theorize different conceptions and understandings of race in Latin America versus in the United States. They did this in the 1960s, before the subject of race in Latin America became popular in the academy. So in fact, organizations like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, they are responsible for our understanding of race today and the ways in which institutional racism functions in all of the Americas. And these are subjects that we are now studying in history, in American studies, in Black studies and Latino studies. And these people were essentially, many of them college students, many of them were high school students. They were driven by a passion to understand society so that they could transform it. They were influenced by Fanon, by Frantz Fanon, who was an important theorist about which I spoke earlier, and his critique of colonialism. Essentially, they took the writings of Fanon, who had written about how colonialism affects the psyche of the colonized, and they said, well, Puerto Ricans tend to deny their race. And people in Latin America do not identify with race, they identify with language, culture, and ethnicity. And they also said, if you study Puerto Ricans, you'll note that light Puerto Ricans claim to be white Americans. And black Puerto Ricans tend to cling to their Puerto Rican identification to avoid being called African American or to avoid being linked to the people at the bottom of American society, right? And they critiqued this, that they said this is a problem. Why? Why distance yourself from African Americans if we share a similar oppression, and we certainly share a similar history of slavery, even though in different countries. So they explore in their writings and in their discussions the psychological wages of racism on the colonial subject, and therefore they challenged culture of poverty arguments, which posits that the problems in the Puerto Rican community have everything to do with Puerto Ricans and their behaviors and their attitudes, rather than with the structures of racism in these societies. So essentially, the Young Lords is important because it attempts to make public a conversation about race that had generally been confined to academic circles or hushed whispers between Puerto Ricans. The race was like a hushed whisper against Puerto Ricans. It still is amongst many Latinos. And oftentimes, Puerto Ricans and Latinos are unmindful of the racially charged and politically problematic implications of their comments. For example, this conversation within the Puerto Rican and Latino community of pelo bueno and pelo malo, whether you have good hair, right, straight hair, or bad hair, which is kinky hair. So these organizations, they decided, you know what, if we're gonna deal with this problem of racism, we're going to have to address it and understand the roots of it and tackle the problem from the root. So this kind of analysis of self, of the group, of Puerto Ricans, or of the broader issue of racism, right, within Puerto Rican community, but also in Latin America, established a strong foundation for their expressed solidarity and activism alongside African Americans. And this solidarity was along shared class lines. The most visible articulation of African American and Puerto Rican solidarity within the Young Lords surfaced within the organization's membership body, Okay, so this is my next photograph. This photograph looks like what? A photograph of what? Of the Black Panther Party, but this guy is a young lord. This is a black and white photograph, so you can't see that his beret is not black, because that was the color, actually blue, light blue, is not blue. Those were the colors of the Black Panther Party. His beret is actually purple, which was the color of the young lords. So this guy is not a Black Panther, he's a young lord. According to Iris Morales, who's a documentarian and a former member of the organization, quote, activists who had participated in the civil rights, black liberation, and cultural nationalist movements joined the Young Lords. Puerto Ricans made up the majority of the members, but African Americans, Morales estimated, quote, made up about 25% of the membership. Other Latinos, Cubans, Dominicans, Mexicans, Panamanians, and Colombians also joined. One member was Japanese Hawaiian. So essentially, African Americans joined the organization because the Young Lords was launching campaigns that they could relate to, like around the issues of poverty, education, police brutality, racism, etc. But also, the leadership of the Young Lords was also very racially diverse. What do I mean by that? The attraction of the Young Lords to African Americans, or the fact that African Americans were attracted to the Young Lords in New York, was certainly influenced by the fact that its leadership body was composed in part of two black Puerto Ricans, Felipe Luciano and Juan F. Ortiz, and an Afro-Cuban, Pablo Guzman. These photographs are meant to give you a sense of the racial, these are all Young Lords, of the racial diversity of the organization, the ethnic diversity. And this photograph is instructive because one member of the organization, or someone who associated with the organization, this person here, is Asian. The third guy in, who's holding a coffin of a young lord who was found hanging in the Tombs, a prison in New York. This is one of their other campaigns. Again, you see that there were African Americans with Puerto Ricans in the organization. And here, this is the photograph of the leadership of the organization. These were the core group of men who were part of the formal leadership, and three of them, the guys with the afros, they're Puerto Rican. So the leadership itself reflected a pretty advanced or progressive perspective on race. But also, one of the fascinating things about the organization is that African Americans were not merely passive participants, but were integral to its lifeblood. Denise Oliver, an African American woman, was the first woman elected to the Young Lords' formal leadership body, and I'm going to show you a picture of her right now. This is Denise Oliver. Most people think that Denise Oliver is Puerto Rican, but in fact, she's African American. And she was a member of SNCC, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She left the Young Lords because there was a split in the Young Lords, and she joined the Black Panther Party. And part of what we see in this period is that people went in and out of different organizations for different reasons, oftentimes, if they were people of color, without thinking too much about the issue of whether they belonged because of race. So this is important because we live in a society that is divided along racial lines. Whenever you enter into the cafeteria, you see that. The white kids are sitting together, the Latino kids are sitting together oftentimes, and the black kids are sitting separately. But in the 1960s, something incredible happened in the United States, which is that those racial barriers began to be broken. And those moments are rare and few and far between in American society. And that's why this history is so important, because it is actually an example of people beginning to come together across class lines, independently of race, but still understanding that the centrality of race in American society is not something that you can wish away. The way you build cross-ethnic and racial solidarity is actually by addressing the issue of racism, not by ignoring it. So African Americans were drawn to the Young Lords because the issues around which they organized affected poor African Americans too, like child hunger, lead poisoning, poor housing, poor schools, poor health care, police brutality, etc. And even though the Young Lords routinely declare its faith to nationalist politics, to like Puerto Rican nationalist politics and the liberation of Puerto Rico, on the ground, they actively forged connections along shared class interests and across ethnic lines in all of the work they did. Just very quickly, and I'm going to end soon, I interviewed one of the members of the Young Lords whose name is Panama Alba. He's Panamanian, and he was a member of the Young Lords. And I said, you know, you're Panamanian. What were you doing in a Puerto Rican organization? And he said, you have to understand that this was the moment during which Che Guevara, an Argentinian, is fighting in the Cuban Revolution. This is a moment of solidarity, and people are fighting and learning each other's struggles and each other's stories. And they understand that the only way they will win is if they come together and fight each other's fights. It was just an incredible moment during that interview. So the question is, what combination of forces made this possible? For Puerto Ricans in particular, I talked about this radicalization in broader society that was leading people to draw revolutionary conclusions. But what forces within the Puerto Rican community were making this happen? The timing of Puerto Rican migration is critical. Puerto Ricans began to migrate to the United States in large numbers in 1947 after Operation Bootstrap. Operation Bootstrap was an industrialization project launched by the United States on the island of Puerto Rico that displaced a lot of peasants, much like peasants have been displaced from Mexico recently, right? The reason why Washington Heights, which was previously Dominican and still is now increasingly Mexican, is because of these policies that essentially established these huge corporate industries in Mexico that displaced these small farmers. This happened most recently with, what's the name of the policy that escapes me? NAFTA, right, NAFTA in the 1990s. Well, a similar situation happened in Puerto Rico in 1947, and all these peasants were displaced, and they settled in cities like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. So the timing of Puerto Rican migration is going to be critical in terms of how it's going to influence the consciousness of these new migrants, right? They are migrating to the United States at a very special moment in American history. They would be profoundly influenced by the civil rights movement. Puerto Ricans are going to be hugely influenced by the civil rights movement. They're going to be hugely influenced by the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. And generally by the radical awakening of the second half of the 1960s. So the fact that they're coming to this country when the nation is in struggle, when all of these leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King are talking about race, that's going to influence the consciousness of Puerto Ricans. What else? The increased awareness and understanding that Puerto Ricans were colonial subjects made many of them see similarities in their experiences with African Americans. So this was a period after World War II when nations were proclaiming their independence. From India to Vietnam to the entire map of Africa, Algeria, nations were fighting against colonialism, asserting their independence. Puerto Rico has this weird relationship with the United States, and an awareness of colonialism and its impact on Puerto Rico is also going to lead some within the Puerto Rican community here to say, well, you know, we are oppressed in Puerto Rico much much like the African Americans have been oppressed here by the U.S. because of slavery and this history. Both of these groups, African Americans and Puerto Ricans, were racialized by the experience of police brutality, right? Both Puerto Ricans and African Americans suffered deaths in their community because of police brutality, and that brought them together. They were reared, both of these groups, under similar social and economic conditions. This common experience between Puerto Ricans and African Americans was expressed in music. So before these common currents were articulated politically by the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party, the fact that there had to be solidarity between these groups, we heard this connection in music. Despite their differences, Puerto Ricans and African Americans had for decades worked, studied, and created music alongside each other, much like they did in the 1970s with the birth of hip-hop. Part of what we probably don't know is that Puerto Ricans and African Americans together were responsible for the birth of hip-hop, and Puerto Ricans in particular are responsible for the birth of breakdancing. So sociologist and cultural theorist Juan Flores tells us that, quote, African Americans and Puerto Ricans in New York had been partying together for many years. Since the musical revolution of the late 1940s, when musical giants like Mario Bauza, Machito, and Dizzy Gillespie joined forces in the creation of Cubop, or Latin jazz. So it was on the dance floor that the experience of a generation of blacks and Puerto Ricans reared in a moment of racial struggle and solidarity, gave shape to the Boogaloo, which combined R&B and soul traditions with Afro-Cuban musical idioms. The Boogaloo became hugely popular among African Americans and Puerto Ricans, with Joe Cuba's Bang Bang and Pete Rodriguez's I Like It Like That. So these were songs that people were dancing together, even though they kind of hated each other, before the Young Lords and the Black Panthers actually argued about this cross-ethnic solidarity and its importance. And this is what one of the members of the Young Lords said, Felipe Luciano, who's the leader of the Young Lords. The relationships that Puerto Ricans developed with African American people were so deep and so loving and so contradictory and so enmeshed that it developed a new culture, and you could hear it in the music. Blacks and Puerto Ricans in New York, when you say the word, it already connotes a whole experience. So why is this history important to document? It's very important for young Latinos, because Latinos are the fastest growing population in America. And it's important for Latinos to see themselves as actors in American history, and they are. The presence of Latinos in the movements contributed greatly to an expansion of the meaning of racial democracy in America. But also in this case, this group is actually arguing that Latinos have common cause with African Americans, but also with poor whites. The very presence of a people who thought very differently about race, Puerto Ricans, challenged the straitjacket of America's black-white dichotomy. It opened up a different way of seeing race. Writing the Young Lords, Latinos into the history of the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power Movement is the best way to honor the Civil Rights and Black Power movements and do justice to its profoundly democratic dimensions. It is the only movement in American history, or one of the only movements, that brought so many people of different ethnicities and colors together. The movement itself was a profoundly multi-ethnic and multiracial phenomenon. And I think we should study this period, the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, and the radical movements of the late 1960s, because it was a moment during which young people like yourselves essentially fought to strive for the highest aspirations of humanity, and in many ways civilized American society today. We are who we are as a society because of the the sacrifices, of the courage, of the passion of young people like the Young Lords. And it is my hope that you will participate in this new wave of social protest that's happening in American society. Every moment of note in American history that has expanded American democracy has happened because of a social movement. Whether it was the Civil War or the labor struggles of the 1890s or the union struggles of the 1930s or the civil rights and black power movements of the 1960s, social protest has historically made America make good on its promise of democracy. And I think that it's very important for us to be speaking about this here at Old Westbury, an institution that claims to be committed to this project. Thank you very much.